G'day everyone, it's Ben Morgan, Chief Executive of the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association of Australia, and this morning a very quick video just to follow up on yesterday's AOPA May Day event here at Bankstown Airport, and the weather today is just absolutely fantastic, and it followed on from a wonderful opportunity to catch up with South Australian Senator Rex Patrick, who made some pretty strong announcements there yesterday regarding his intentions in the next parliamentary turn, should he be successful at this year's election, which we hope that he is. Before I kick into just some comments about what Rex Patrick has announced, I'd just like to extend a sincere thank you to everybody who flew in from all points of Australia to take part in that event. We had aircraft owners and pilots and industry representatives that came from as far as Western Australia, South Australia, from down in Victoria, from New South Wales, from Queensland. We had representatives from the Northern Territory who came there. I'm not sure if we had anyone from Tassie, but if there was someone from Tassie, don't hesitate to shout out. We will give you a specific shout out as well. But the event was a really interesting event to attend, because what it did was it signified a recognition that the regulatory system that we have here in Australia is not working. And we all know this. We all know this from all of us right across the aviation industry that participate in aviation. It doesn't matter what part of aviation you're in, we have an intimate understanding that the regulations we have here in Australia are just not working. We have charter companies that are struggling under the weight of CASA's regulation in that space, and are now looking down the pipeline of entirely new regulations again that are going to put further pressure on the aviation industry. And we heard from the past Director of Aviation Safety not long before he departed CASA that it was his intention, and he believes that it's always been CASA's aspiration, to subject our small to medium-sized general aviation industry to the same level of regulatory compliance and cost as to what the airlines are enduring. And I know that I speak on behalf of so many charter operators around the country who are simply saying, we can't do this. It's not done anywhere else in the world. Why are we doing this here in Australia? We're not improving safety. We're undermining safety by making businesses less profitable, businesses less sustainable, and of course the aviation industry then gets put at risk when we have businesses and operators under such stress. As private aircraft owners and private flyers and recreational flyers and sport experimental flyers right across the country, we also know that CASA's rule set's not working. We have a pilot medical certification regulations are so out of step with what's happening globally. Whether you're flying a light sport aeroplane for RAOs, or whether you're flying a sport experimental aeroplane in support of the Sport Aircraft Association or general aviation as a member of AOPA, it doesn't matter where you are. We all have an understanding of how out of step the CASA has become. And I think as time is moving forward, and we now start to see things like the drone industry taking off, with eVTOL now going through flight testing abroad in Europe and the United States, none of this is happening in Australia. And the reason none of this is happening in Australia on any large scale is because Australia is so far out of step. And as I've just said, as things are advancing in aviation worldwide, as the technology is improving, as there is large innovation occurring, what is becoming glaringly obvious is how far behind the CASA are in bringing the nation forward. As we said yesterday, there are some great people who work inside of CASA. Don't take this commentary that every last person who works inside of the Civil Aviation Safety Authority is a bad person, because that's just not true. But the rule set that has been developed is just not working. I outlined yesterday as part of the presentation that over the last 30 years, CASA have worked through a regulatory modernisation and reform agenda that has spent over 2.5 billion plus of taxpayer money. A program that has resulted in regulations that are more complex, more onerous, that are deeper, more pages of it, and it's not improving aviation in this country. It's actually taking us backwards. And so something has to change. And when we look abroad to the United States, what we see is an aviation industry that's thriving. And we're very fortunate that one of the directors of AOPA is based in the United States. He's a former deputy director of CASA. He understands the Australian system, and he also understands the US system. And he's the first in line saying Australia has it wrong and we desperately need to change. We need to set a new course for aviation, and that course can't be yet another band-aid on a broken system. 30 years of band-aids and 30 years of bandages and 30 years of life support for a regulatory system that's just not working is creating massive decline in aviation in this country, and it needs to be fixed, and it needs to be fixed fast. And so what was it that Senator Rex Patrick announced, and why is it important? Well, what Senator Rex Patrick announced at the event yesterday is that he is firm and certain that Australia needs to move to the US Federal Aviation Administration rules. That Australia, in order to go forward, our small to medium-sized aviation industry needs to transition as a certainty to the US rules. And he understands why. He knows that aircraft design and innovation and manufacturing is not happening in Australia because the rules are too onerous, too cumbersome, too out of date, and businesses can't in a cost-effective manner navigate them. We had people attending yesterday who were part of the aviation industry parts and manufacturing sector, and they were there in support and demonstrating absolute support for the fact that they themselves can't produce parts in Australia anymore, and to get them certified and recognised abroad, that instead they're taking their parts to the United States, they're designing and manufacturing them in the US, they're certificating them in the US, and then CASA's just saying, okay, we now accept them. This is ridiculous. Australia deserves a strong, prosperous, successful and sustainable aviation industry. Young people in Australia deserve the right to grow up and to aspire towards a career in aviation, whether they're innovating the next electric aircraft or the next eVTOL aeroplane, they're innovating drones for all kinds of civil application or military application, or whether they're participating in aviation as a pilot, a maintainer, it doesn't matter. Future Australians deserve a strong, sustainable aviation industry, and Senator Rex Patrick gets that. And he has proposed that the Australian Parliament needs to take action into its hands. Not CASA, not go back to the Civil Aviation Safety Authority and ask an organisation that has architected 30 years of regulatory disaster, but instead the Australian Parliament take action, our politicians take action, that they initiate an independent review on how the Australian government will implement FAA rules for small to medium-sized aviation and to position Australia for aviation success. And that is the distinction here that needs to be understood in what the Senator announced. He's not suggesting a review to consider the FAA rules. He's suggesting that the government initiate an independent review to outline how the government will, in fact, introduce and roll out the FAA rules in this country, and to get it done, and to take that process out of CASA's hands, who continue to tell everybody it can't be done. And this is very important. Understand this. Every single time the Australian aviation industry goes to CASA and says, why don't we simply take the US rules in this space and adopt them, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority says it can't be done. They take the US outline, they then bastardise it, they manipulate it, and what they deliver to us in Australia, in many cases and in most cases, looks nothing like the US system. And then of course the consequence outcome of when it's rolled out is that it doesn't work like the US system. It costs the industry money, and then when everyone's sitting around post-implementation saying this is not working, of course everyone else is wrong and CASA is always right. And this is something that I've noticed with CASA over the years, remembering there's good people that work inside of CASA, and I'm the first person to say that. But why is it that 30 years after they started their regulatory modernisation and reform program, that it's the industry still that's got it wrong? That it's the industry that's always wrong when it comes to CASA's rules? That the industry's never right, that CASA have always been right, that CASA have always gotten it right, and that CASA is absolutely correct in delivering what they have? Well, we all know that's bullshit. It's total bullshit, and it's got to stop. CASA are in the business of protecting CASA. We're awake to this. Everybody knows what's going on. They don't want to recognise their faults. They don't want to recognise their failures. And if I'm incorrect in saying this, then I encourage CASA to come forward and to publish an outline as to where they've admitted that they've done the wrong thing and that it actually had a negative outcome, and show the Australian public where in fact they got it wrong and how they took actions and steps to fix it. Cessna SIDS is a classic example. Everyone across the aviation industry warned them at the time of implementation. The way you're doing this will result in people packing up aircraft and getting rid of them. You're going to end up with excessive costs applied to industry. You need a more progressive way of doing it. You need to consider following the way the US have done it. The US don't have aircraft falling out of the sky. The US have the same environmental conditions as Australia. Anyone who wants to argue Australia's a more corrosive environment, you need to visit Florida. You need to go and visit the entire Florida Key and have a look at the humidity and the moisture and the corrosion that happens in aircraft there. It's just another example of CASA not listening to industry and forcibly telling us all of the while that we've got it wrong and that they've got it right. And so the answer is, if the Australian system that you've designed us at a cost of 2.5 billion was so good, why is half the Australian registered fleet not flying anymore? There's an answer to that. And the answer is that the rules and the regulations just haven't supported keeping aviation buoyant and keeping aviation flying. And the US does exactly the opposite. I love going to the United States, not only to catch up with our AOPA friends there, but with pilots and aviators right across the United States, because the entire culture in the United States is different. There is a feeling that the FAA support aviation, the FAA want to see aviation thrive. We don't see this here in Australia. There is a fundamental cultural difference to the way in which the United States approach the fostering and development of aviation as to how the Civil Aviation Safety Authority in this country see their role. Unfortunately, I get to see the worst of it. Many of you probably never get to see many of the things that I get to read through and be involved in. But I can tell you that AOPA Australia is extremely concerned with the number of aviators that find themselves at the mercy of a regulator whose lawyers appear to be hell-bent on burying them. This has got to change. This has got to stop. We need to look to the United States and we need to say to ourselves, why not? And I think Senator Rex Patrick has made it extremely clear in his presentation that as a sitting member of our government, as an individual who's elected by the people of Australia, and he made clear that he works on behalf of his constituents, not on behalf of a party and not on behalf of a bureaucracy. He's there to represent Australians. And it's wonderful to see an elected official recognising that Australia can have a strong future, but we just need to make the change. And so his recommendation, not his recommendation, but I guess his commitment, he said he's pledging this support, is that for small to medium-sized aviation in this country, the future must be the implementation of the US Federal Aviation Rule Set for Australia, unlocking the potential of Australia and Australians, ensuring that all of the innovation and entrepreneurism towards aviation stays in Australia and is encouraged to be fostered and developed in this country. He wants to see a strong future of Australians getting involved in aircraft design and manufacture, and he wants to see the aviation industry thriving. And there's great reasons for it. There's going to be a lot of demand for pilots for the airline industry as things get going again. But I know that I speak for most people in aviation in saying we want our businesses to succeed. We want our businesses to be sound. We want sustainability. We want to feel like aviation is something that the nation embraces and that our national safety regulator has a stake in seeing succeed. So I'm fully in support of what Senator Rex Patrick announced on the weekend. I think it's critical to Australia that we look to this change. He's very clear in saying that the FAA rule set is needed to unlock the potential of small to medium-sized aviation. He understands the airline industry may want to stay where it's at today. My prediction is if we made the change to the US system as a whole and stopped messing about with it and fiddling the books and Australianising all this nonsense, after all, what do we know about aviation that the Americans don't? If we were to implement an FAA-based system and move Australia forward, I dare say that the airlines eventually would look at it and say, how about us too? And I think that that would be a great outcome to bring Australia into full international alignment with the US. And let's just think about some of the economic benefits for the broader economy in this. By standardising, it would open up the trade of aircraft between the United States and Australia enormously. It would make selling aircraft to the United States and buying aircraft in from the United States a super easy, super streamlined process. It would make flying between the two countries super easy. Why wouldn't we want to aspire to having thousands of American pilots visiting Australia and taking part in aviation, and likewise Us in Australia going to the United States and being able to participate in aviation too. That's got to be a good thing for the aviation economy. Wouldn't it be wonderful if some of the largest American aircraft manufacturers looked to Australia and said, because of the currency advantage we have of investing in Australia, we'd prefer to build our aeroplanes here. Seeing locations right across Bankstown, Moorabbin, Parafield, Jandakot, Archerfield be reactivated and come to life, building aircraft components, sub-assemblies or even complete aeroplanes. We've got to get the industry working again. We've got to see a focus on rejuvenating and completely rebuilding our aircraft engineering communities, encouraging thousands of young people to want to get involved in aviation and have a career. And importantly, we want to see the airline industry start making investments back on Australian shores and bringing all those engineering jobs that they've outsourced to the US back home here to Australia, so that Australian men and women have the opportunity to work on Australian registered aircraft and to build their futures and to have a career in an industry that they love and are so passionate about. The only way we can do this, the only viable pathway for Australia to get this type of aviation economic drive and resurgence is for us to adopt a rule set that's going to enable us to do it. To believe that we can continue to create unique Australian regulations and to continue to exempt everything that's broken with them and band-aid everything that's broken with them is an absurdity. And the only beneficiaries from continuing to do this will be the people who work for CASA, and those that pay the price for it will continue to be the industry, aviation business, and of course our aviation economy. Some of you out there might think I'm wrong. Some of you might think that sticking with the Australian regulations is the only future. And there are those of you out there that believe in that. But I challenge you, if you disagree, to write to AOPA and to put on the table how you think sticking with the Australian regulations is going to benefit the country when so many of our businesses are packing up and shutting down. Just yesterday, I got an email from an aviation maintenance and charter company who've handed in the towel. They're refusing to move to the new regulations. They've had enough of spending their life savings rewriting their manuals. They've had enough of spending their superannuation on recomplying to get another change. And they intimately understand, having had experience in the US, just how different it is and how much easier it is to run your business. And there's no degradation of safety. This concept that CASA purveys and peddles, that only under the Australian system can you be guaranteed safety, is just a farce. It's a complete farce. Aviation medicals are a great example of that. The United States reformed their aviation medical regulations and the data's out. 5 years later, no impact on aviation safety, and yet here's our boffinry in CASA, and I'll call them boffinry. The boffins down in CASA are sitting around the table bickering amongst themselves, and they can't, quote, gain a consensus for change. I'd have to argue, if you can't modernise Australia's aviation medical certification standards after 5 years of the world's largest economies doing so, Jesus Christ, CASA, you've got a problem. You have a problem. And I feel for Pip Spence, and I'm out there on the record. I'm a big supporter of Pip Spence, who's our current Director of Aviation Safety. I like her. I think she means well. I think she'd like to really move the needle to get things working. But how in hell do you get CASA moving if you're going to spend 5 years debating whether you should make a change or not? None of us in the commercial world can spend 5 years making a decision on something. And yet the entire aviation industry is held to ransom every time this happens. And it's not like it just happens on aviation medicals. This has been going on for 30 years. There are too many delays. There are too many excuses. There are too many nonsenses published. It's got to stop. Australia needs sensible aviation regulations that work. And if CASA cannot design and deliver regulations in a timely fashion that work, then the only option is to adopt aviation regulations that do work and simply implement them. Take the design, take the decision making and take the delays out of CASA's hands and see to it that they deliver regulations that are proven and that work and don't require CASA to do a thing. That may very well have to be the answer. So we're in full support. of South Australian Senator Rex Patrick and his desire to bring forward a parliamentary review on how the government implements the US SAAA regulations into Australia. We'll be doing everything that we can from AOPA's perspective to encourage all other members of government to support this process. This is about unlocking our industry. It's about unlocking aviation business. It's about opening up the jobs available to current Australians and future Australians. This is about empowering Australian aviation and the national economy to go forward. And I encourage each and every one of you across the aviation industry to start getting behind this movement. We can't wait another 30 years for Australia to finally arrive at a point where we have workable rules. Aviation businesses are making clear, enough's enough, no more. We can't do this. The people in CASA have become so detached from reality, they don't know what they're doing anymore. And I actually tend to this. I believe that most of the people at CASA actually don't understand just how their rules are being interpreted and put to use in the industry. They've got no clue as to the cost consequence of their changes on industry. They don't have any idea as to the damage they're doing to aviation. And that's because for the vast majority of them, they live in Aviation House in Canberra. Most of these people haven't been involved in aviation business. They don't know what's going on. That's got to change. Australia needs a better solution than what we've been given, and the only way it's going to be achieved is by the Parliament in this country taking parliamentary action, excluding CASA from that process and bringing about the kinds of reforms that are needed to take Australia forward. Now, I've spoken enough on that. I had a great catch up with Senator Rex Patrick this morning to thank him and his team for making the time to come and meet everybody. I thank everyone from the aviation industry that came out in support of this. We are going to get change. This is going to happen because we're not going to give up. This is going to happen. We are going to drive this. We're going to make certain that the pressure stays on and that we get there in the end to deliver Australia workable regulations. And in the meantime, CASA have an enormous opportunity. CASA have an opportunity to get off their backside and actually go and deliver reforms in the meantime and maybe hopefully demonstrate to the Australian Parliament that they actually can make the kinds of changes that are needed to bring about vast reform and simplification of the rules. A great place to start, Pip Spence, Director of Aviation Safety, is for you to take action and make a decision. You're paid by the Australian people as the Director of Aviation Safety to make a decision. You are the key decision maker in your organisation. You can tomorrow announce that you are ending this nonsense on medical reform consultation. You know the answers. America has led the way. Simply deliver an outcome and sign out medical reform that mirrors the United States and gets on with delivering Australia a sensible outcome that will get aviators flying. And then let's start the work of adopting the US standards elsewhere. Or, if CASA are unable to do it, you run the risk of the Parliament doing it for you. I know which route I'd like to take. I'd encourage you to get out there and start making it happen, but in the end, if you can't, and we understand maybe you're working in a system where you can't, but maybe the answer is that the parliamentarians make the decisions for you all in Canberra. I'm Ben Morgan from AOPA Australia. I thank everyone for their ongoing support. If you like what AOPA is doing in trying to shed light on these issues and to take affirmative action in bringing about change, I thoroughly encourage you to get involved, take up a membership to the association. Membership's $159 to put fuel in the tanks to enable us to keep up the fight. And we're going to be working with key MPs and key senators and all the parliamentary parties in ensuring that Australia is positioned over this next 20 years for solid growth. And I'll tell you one thing, we're not going to give up. We won't be walking away from any of this. Anyone inside of CASA that believes that this will just die down and disappear, you are sadly mistaken. The time for Australia to have great aviation regulations that encourage our industry and encourage our people to succeed is now, and we want to get the job done. So thank you everyone for your support. And until next time, this is AOPA.